morning. My name is Joanne Porter, and my maiden name is Anderson. You might even recognize me. I'm at the library pretty often, and we're looking forward to you all kids being able to come back to the library. But what I'm here today for is to talk about the Rattlesnake Homesteaders, and you know Rattlesnake Mountain or Hills is just north of Prosser. Basically from Benton, the county line road over to close to Benton City. So that whole section out there, it's dry land, and it started getting settled by homesteaders at the turn of the century. My family, my grandparents, Gustav and Anna Anderson, were immigrants from Sweden. And they were in Nebraska raising their family, and they heard about homestead opportunities in a place called Rattlesnake, Prosser, Washington. So on a bit of faith, they loaded up 4 little kids and got on the train, and out they came. And so this would be 1905 when they arrived in Prosser. And at that point, they set up their homestead, 160 acres, just at the end of Missimer Road. And when they got here, it was pretty much the end of the homesteading applications. Rattlesnake Hills was already filling up with homesteaders and young families, so they became part of the community, the Rattlesnake community. There was, at this time, between, I'd say 1905 and 1930, maybe 40 households out there. There was, at one point, 80 applications for homesteads out there. So there was a lot of people out there. They established 5 schools scattered around because state law had it that kids should not have to walk more than 3 miles to get to their school. We're talking about rough country and no buses, no roads, just kids walking to school in all kinds of weather. So with the 5 schools, that took care of quite a few kids. Let's see, Jessie, this story is about Jessie Knowles. And she went to the Cochran School, which is near Crooks and Crosby Road. And Jessie and her family lived in a canyon, so her and her siblings had quite a long walk, actually. And so I will just read Jessie's story as I wrote it up, and I just want to say that I had to do a lot of research to find this story. I wasn't smart enough to ask my dad and his generation more questions, and they passed on. And as growing up, I'd heard about Jessie and the haunted house that she lived in. And I just didn't know anything about it, so I started digging around and talking to the second generation people, and I got most of my information from old newspapers, just going through microfilm. So this is what I found out about Jessie. So I'll just go ahead and read this. Did you know that there lies a mystery in our own beloved Rattlesnake Hills? A mystery that may never be explained, but because of this, Jessie Knowles will not be forgotten. This is the story of a tender young girl, Jessie Knowles, age sweet 16. The story of Jessie's short life is tragic, poignant, and will continue to remain in my heart and perhaps yours also. The Knowles family were from Iowa. They arrived on Rattlesnake in 1901. Fred Knowles and his wife Elizabeth, or Annie as she was called, were in their early 30s, and with them came their 6 children. Catherine was 9, Jessie 8, Louis 7, George 6, Carrie 3, and Olive 2. My, that's a lot of kids. One after the other. 3 more children were born on Rattlesnake, and that would be Vivian, 1902, Clarence, 1904, and Lizzie, 1905. The children attended the Cochran School, which was several miles from their home. Mr. Knowles received patent or deed for his Rattlesnake homestead of 160 acres in 1907. Their homestead land description was the southeast quarter of Section 6 and Township 10, Range 25 East, which generally speaking is west of Crosby Road and north of Thurman Hamilton's home. Well, it's safe to say that homesteading in sagebrush country would be a challenge. You add 6 kids, soon to be 9 young children, and you just imagine the hard work just to keep each day to keep that family going. There was no water. They had to carry water from springs in the canyons. They certainly no electricity. They used coal and sagebrush for fuel and cooking. I can't imagine how they kept those kids clothed and fed and clean, but I guess they did. Catherine and Jessie were old enough to help their mother, but Fred's boys were too young to do field work. The Knowles did not have the advantage of several of their neighbors. There were the Cochrans, the Crooks, the Joneses, and the Viles, and they had adult sons who had acquired neighboring homesteads, and they could all work together and actually grow some wheat and economically support themselves. Nevertheless, I imagine Fred and Annie were optimistic and hopeful about their future on Rattlesnake as wheat farmers, and early mentions of the Knowles family in the Prosser newspaper under Rattlesnake News gives a glimpse of this family as they were active and valued members of their community. It says in the newspaper, February 1904, Mr. and Mrs. Knowles visited at Byron Vance's home last week. March 1904. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Knowles are rejoicing over a new plowboy that came to their house to stay on February 22nd. Fred Knowles was doing business last week at the county seat. Mr. Knowles lost another one of his workhorses last Saturday. This makes the 3rd one this winter. Mr. Knowles and Vance made a trip to Horse Heaven last Tuesday. May 1905. The families of Mr. and Mrs. Knowles, Claire Kimball, and John Clare spent Easter with Bert Clare. Then September 1905. Mr. Knowles bought a quarter section of land from Clem Viles. November 1905, Maud Vance and Ruth Dyke spent Tuesday with Jessie Knowles. Then July 1905 came, and it brought a new baby to the Knowles homestead, and at the same time it brought just devastation to the family. Annie Knowles died shortly after giving birth to her 9th child, a little girl they named Elizabeth after her mother. Dr. French was summoned to the Knowles home far out on Rattlesnake, but he was unable to save her. A newspaper clipping, July 1905. Mrs. F.E. Knowles of Rattlesnake died Tuesday. The funeral being held in this city today, and the remains interned in the IOOF cemetery. She leaves a husband and 9 children, including a baby a day old. Mr. Knowles is one of the old settlers in the Rattlesnakes and has the sympathy of everyone in his terrible affliction. So Jessie's story really begins at the death of her dear mother, which was July 18th, 1905. At this time, The family lived in a small two-story house in a canyon east of Mr. Hamilton's home. At the young age of 12 years, Jessie found herself burdened with many more cares. Her older sister, Catherine, was unable to endure the isolation out on the homestead, and she had moved to town and was working at the Prosser Central Hotel. Neighbor women came and they took the newborn baby Elizabeth into their homes through her infancy. Jessie's father was out working, often gone for days at a time. He was foreman of threshing crews for Rattlesnake and Horse Heaven. He was working hard, trying to support his family. But Jessie was there. She was the oldest one, and it seemed a losing battle. In later life, Jessie's brother George refused to say much about their life on Rattlesnake, only that they suffered a great deal without a mother there, and sometimes struggled for just necessities. And in fact, they were reduced in the end to selling belongings just for food, and the term starved out became a terrible reality for the Knowles family. So, what happened to Jessie on January 28, 1910, 5 years after her mother died? We know that for the past 5 years after her mother's death, Jessie had been devoted to caring for her 7 younger siblings and keeping her family together. The early morning of January 28th came cold with an icy north wind. Jessie decided to keep the 2 youngest children home from school, as it was a long walk with canyon crossings to get to the schoolhouse. But this day was special, and Jessie knew it. She saw to all her morning chores with extra attention. The house was made clean, ample wood in the stove, fresh bread was baked and cooling by noontime. Then Jessie sat down and she wrote a heartbreaking goodbye letter to her father and family. She also wrote a letter to her sweetheart, and then a short note to the children's teacher, Miss Marie Allen. And the younger children were unaware that anything was wrong. Jessie just bundled them up and sent them to the schoolhouse. Jessie's note to her teacher stated, "I will be dead when you read this, so please send my brothers and sisters home." Jessie had prepared herself by fixing her hair, putting on her best dress, stockings and shoes. She tucked a picture of her sweetheart into the front of her dress, and she simply laid down on her bed and died. The shocked Miss Allen and the Knowles children hurried to the home, but Jessie had passed on. She was gone, perhaps as she had mentioned to her letter and her father, that she was now with her mother, who Jessie said had been coming to her in dreams, asking her to join her in heaven. The neighbors came, the authorities were summoned, the coroner, Dr. H.W. Howard, and undertaker William Guernsey. They came and they studied the scene, and they later performed an autopsy at Guernsey's funeral home. A definitive cause of death could not be identified, although Jessie did have some signs of infection internally. Suicide as a cause of death was ruled out, although considering the circumstances, it was initially suspected. Jessie's sudden and strange death shocked and saddened all the neighboring homestead families on Rattlesnake. The Gus and Anna Anderson homestead was just 4 miles west of Jessie's home, and although the Anderson children did not attend the Cochran School, they all knew Jessie and her brothers and sisters. And in 1910, my uncle Ernest Anderson was 14, Henry was 11, my dad Elmer was 8 years old, and Elin was 6. Elmer remembered that all the Rattlesnake schools rang their bells at the sad news of Jessie's death. The Prosser newspaper, Benton Independent, printed on the front page this headline and continuing story: "Sad and sudden death of popular young lady." Sudden death overtakes popular young lady of the Rattlesnake who seemed to be prepared. Miss Jessie Knowles dies after leaving word for friends and relatives that she was about to pass into the great beyond, and death results. Death results show natural causes. Doctor is mystified. At this time, William Guernsey, the undertaker, served Prosser as the Prosser mayor. He was the undertaker. He had a furniture store. And Mr. Guernsey was so affected by Jessie and her heartbreaking letters that 25 years later, in 1936, he felt compelled to write about his experience and how Jessie had left him with a haunting memory of her last moments of life. Mr. Guernsey wrote in part, quote, "She lay on the bed as though sleeping, her hair neatly combed, completely and prettily dressed, and even had on her shoes. Tucked in the bosom of her dress was the photo of a neighbor boy, and 2 letters, one to her sister and the other to her father. Having no pencil, she had made ink with ball bluing with which to write with. Although 25 years have passed, I can remember the letter to her father, word for word. My dear father, for a long time I have not been well. Today I am worse, and so it is that I, by myself, must die. When I get up to heaven, I will tell dear Mama just how good and kind you have been to all of us. You know, Mama has never seen little Lizzie, so I can tell her what a good and pretty girl she is. And I want you to place Myron's picture in my hand so that I can show Mama what my sweetheart is like. And please be patient with Kate. She is lonesome up here and wants to be down in the valley. And so, my dear father, goodbye, goodbye, Jessie." Mr. Guernsey continues on and he says, 2 silent men drove down the mountain slopes late that night. Those letters were disturbing. They did not tally with our ideas of suicide. Our daily business had to do with death, yet hovering over this whole affair was a greatness we could not fathom. Where had an uneducated country girl received the power of expression as revealed in that wonderful sentence? And so it is I, by myself, must die. For 25 years, I have tried to improve upon it and failed. Yet this young girl wrote it hurriedly as the grim reaper swung his scythe. The angel of death was at her side, and she, with great faith in God, cast aside the burdens, what had for 5 years had been too heavy for her tender young shoulders, and she lay down to eternal rest. The folks on Rattlesnake also did not forget Jessie. Rumors were such that laid some responsibility for Jessie's death on her father. He may have lost favor with neighbors. It is impossible to say, but the family could not continue to survive on Rattlesnake. Within a few years, the family broke up and left Rattlesnake. The 1920 census shows Mr. Knowles with 2 of his sons, Clarence and George, in the St. John, Spokane area. And from this time on, Jessie's house became known as the Haunted House. Over the years, unexplained occurrences were noted by neighboring farmers in the canyon near the house. Elmer Kimmel's family lived in the house when he was a boy, and Elmer documented that blue lights were seen at night moving eerily in the canyon as if someone were walking unseen, carrying a lantern to find their way in the dark. A half-buried boulder in the canyon was found up out of its ground where it had been resting for a millennium. The Kimmels were so spooked at times that young Elmer, would carry a gun with him. Oral history among the rattlesnake farmers over many years spoke of Jessie in the haunted house. Well, the first and second rattlesnake generations have passed on. The old house still remains, but time is reducing it to rubble. And the canyon remains the same today. It's isolated and lonely. The real haunting, perhaps the real haunting is simply this, that how Jessie on that cold morning somehow recognized and mastered death's approach. How did she know? How is it that death did not come much slower as her life force was just ebbing away? How did this mortal girl do what is not possible aside from purposefully taking one's own life? How did she, which is knowing of and bravely planning for the very hour of death while remaining physically able? As William Guernsey recognized, Jessie was a participant in a greatness we could not fathom. So we say, rest in peace, Jessie. And that is Jessie's story. I'll just add a couple things. It's kind of interesting that Gravity Hill is very near where Jessie lived. And I would like to say just also that Mr. Guernsey was just a wonderful gentleman. He helped develop the town of Prosser. He served Prosser in many, many ways, and he firsthand knew the sorrow of what it is for a young person to pass away. He lost 2 young children to accidents, and can you imagine preparing your own children for coffins? It's just, what a wonderful man he was to love Jessie the way he did. And his family headstones are in the cemetery, East Prosser Cemetery, and if you ever wanted to visit the Guernseys, they're there, him and his wife and his children. One of the rattlesnake farmers years ago gave me, I found these little shoes, pieces of one of the Knowles children's shoes, and obviously they're in pieces, or the shoe is in pieces, and it's can't be repaired or fixed, but I think it's kind of a sweet momentum of all those children that lived in that house and the things they experienced. And they did all grow up. I did talk to a relative some years ago. I was able to track down a relative, and all those kids grew up and had homes and families, and they did well for themselves. And so that is all I have to say about Jessie, and I hope you will enjoy her story. At least remember her, and that would be all. Thank you.